So, what is truth? I remember thinking about this a lot when I started engaging in channeled information, most notably Seth, Ken Carey, and Lazarus in my teenage years. Is it true? The same thing comes up in religious contexts or any philosophical book. Is this true? It's less of an issue around, is this a solid hand? Because that is, is a lot more simple to process and a lot more obvious. I think we'd all agree that this is a solid hand, and that what truth is an accurate representation of reality. And that's an interesting thing, that truth is an accurate representation of reality rather than reality itself. And so in the ultimate sense, reality is truth. And so then we come into this exploration of perception of reality. And if we do not have eyes, or the concept of eyes, is it true that something has a visual appearance? Ultimately, what I come to is that truth is useful information that leads to well-being. That's what useful is. So useful information for well-being. And a map of reality that works. Works for what? That works to create well-being. And to give a sense of that, if you think of the word table, table is useful information that works. If you say avoid the table or put food on the table, what are we talking about? We're not talking about the table. We're talking about a sound. We're talking about a symbol. The word table isn't a table. But the word table is useful information for well-being because it's referencing the table. And so you then say, okay, well, what is it referencing? When I say look at that table, I'm talking about a symbol in sound, and then I'm referencing a symbol in sensory perception. So if I turn my gaze and look at the table, I'm not actually seeing the reality of the table. I'm seeing a slice of the table. I'm not seeing how it touches, how it feels. I'm seeing a slice. I'm seeing something that allows me to imagine what it might feel like based on past experience, but I'm not actually dealing directly with the table. If we look at even a full sensory contact, tasting, touching, engaging with the table, that's not actually the table either. If we zoom back, for example, if we look at the table through a microscope, we're still using the human eyes, but now we're seeing a different aspect of this thing we're calling table. If we look at it through a thermometer, we're seeing another dimension of this thing called table. But there are dimensions of the table that are more complex and that are expanded beyond the dimensions of perception that are these physical senses. And as we move from the word table to looking at the table, to touching the table, to tasting the table, to listening to the sound of the table and knocking it, to feeling how hard it is, to shaking the table. As we engage the table, it gets bigger and bigger. It gets closer to the full reality of the table. But it is not yet the full reality of the table. If we were to look, through an atomic microscope and look at the atoms in the table, now we have a bigger version of the table. A table is a version of X, billions numbers of atoms, and then if we look at different slices of time, we have a bigger version of the table, as opposed to just in this moment. If we follow the table throughout the entire history of making it, if we take the table back to the tree out of which the table was carved, we now have a bigger sense of the table. We have the sense of the table emerging out of the tree. And if we follow the tree back, out of which the table was cut, etc., then we watch the giant tree become a seedling and disappear, and we have a bigger sense of the table because we have a sense of how the tree that became the table became the tree. And if we follow the tree back into the soil out of which the tree emerged, we have a sense of ecological relationships. And if we follow this back deeper and deeper and continue to expand the dimensionality, understanding that in many ways the conscious mind is like an infinite spectrograph that could perceive everything with a big plastic bag over it, a big, black container over it, and then these little puncture holes inside that where certain vibrations can make it through into consciousness. And that's called, the human ego, the human consciousness, the experience in the human body. That we are effectively consciousness isolated from consciousness with these little slits, these little observing and measuring devices carved in to this black box to let a little bit of light in on a few spectrums. And then what we call reality is what registers in those little spectrums. However, reality is much bigger than just what we can register. So particularly when we look at an object in the context of time, we look at it in the context of ecological awareness, because over time, everything is connected. If you follow the table back to the tree, and the tree back to the soil, and the soil back to the various plants that created the soil, and the weather patterns back to the plants and the plants that were created to the weather patterns that led to the creation of the plants. Because if you had 40 degrees below zero constantly, you don't have a tree. You need certain humidities and weather patterns and seed patterns, and so you ultimately find the entire universe existing in the table. But we don't see that. We say that that's a table and that's not a table. But over the course of time, that blurs significantly. And we also say that's what a table smells like when I connect with it with my nose. That's what a table sounds like when I bang it and connect with it with my ears. But what does a table squim like? You see, because we don't have a squim to know what a table squims like. If we had a squim, we might know the dimension of a table measured by a squim. When we create a new instrument like a microscope, we can now say this is what a table looks like in a microscope. If we have an entire new sense, we have a nose, we have a mouth, we have these things called eyes, we have ears, we have sensory nerves that called touch. But what if a squim measures right angles And so if we look through a squim, we would not see what it smells like. We would see how many right angles it has. What if we have a bavga? And a bavga measures the distance between an auric field, meaning an energy field of stuff that our eyes don't see, and measures the rapidity of the transition from one type of energy to another. And that's what that sees. And suddenly the table has this, it has this. In other words, as you expand observing and measuring devices, you expand the reality of the table. And so what if you just continually add observing and measuring devices? So now instead you have all the five senses, but you add another one. You add another one here, a squim here. You add a bavka here. You add a whipcon here. You add something that, one of the ways to experience an object is to move air around it and then observe the air movement. And that could be an entire way of getting to know an object, is you have this little flapper device that you think flap, and it whips around because it's a sense. It's connected to the body. And as the flapper goes by an object, it measures at different points all along the flapper how air currents relate to it and how fast the air that goes out here bounces back, a little bit like sonar, but with air. And then suddenly, you have a sense of flapper. And so you'd get to know someone by flapping around their body and saying, "Oh, I flap you. I have this thing." And to us, it's weird. It's foreign. But not to a flapper who's grown up their whole life getting to know things not through their eyes, but through a flapper. It's weird to think of looking at weird colors. Who would do that when you've got a flapper that can tell you all that data just by wind? And of course, it's so much more fun to feel wind in sensory ways. And you can have biological organisms that have orgasms based on wind pattern as opposed to touch pattern, where you have a transcendent state. And so why would you move around and bang into each other? It's so clumsy, when you could have wind ecstasy, just the movement of air currents. And this is all speaking to the fact that reality is much bigger than we can perceive it, and that in order to relate to reality with a relatively small consciousness, we reduce it to a heuristic symbol, such as table. And we all see a different image. When I say table, I see an image. What's your image? It's not the same image as any other person. The light is your table. When I say table, well lit. What color is it? How tall is it? How big is it? What location is it in? Is it surrounded by other things? I'm just saying table, and everyone's making up a heuristic version of a table. Does yours have 3 legs, 4 legs, 6 legs? It obviously doesn't have 2 legs, but it could have 100 legs. It could be a very large table with 100 legs, but typically we default to 3 or 4 legs. But not always. If there was a country that made 5-legged tables that were round of a certain size, they would default to the 5-legged table. So the key thing is, does it work? If I say, put the food on the table, you're going to glance around for the nearest 3 or 4-legged object with a flat surface and put the food there. if you put the food on the table, then that works. Is it useful information for well-being? Well, if I'm telling you that because the food is about to spill, and if it doesn't spill, we get to eat it, and if it does spill, then we have to throw it out and cook again and waste food and all that, then it's useful information for well-being. Now, I think this is a really important way of looking at truth, in part because you can say something that is true in many different ways. For example, if I say, "What did you do today?" you could say, "I smelled the smell of grapes." And that's true. Or you could say, "I got a new job making $54,000 a year that will allow me to pay back my loan to you." And that's also true. But the latter is more useful in terms of useful information for well-being, a map of reality that works. I can say what's going on in San Rafael. And I could look at from a satellite image or from a jet. There's a matter of perspective. And I could say, well, there's lots of little boxes there representing houses. Or I could just say there's lots of little boxes. I see lots of little squares. That's what's going on in San Rafael. Or I could say the movie theater is playing this movie. Or I could say there's a fire. The fire is, of course, quite useful to know if there's particularly a large spreading fire moving from east to north and stuff like that. That's pretty useful information. One of the things that I'm thinking of is this phenomena of channeling, or tuning into deeper inner truth and information. And whether it's dreams or meditation or diary or feelings, the question is it useful to well-being? Does it lead to a map of reality that works? And the channeled entity Seth, for example, says that you can have a dream about a city 300 years ago, where you enter the reality of the city, but it's 300 years ago. And so you might see what the city was like 300 years ago. As you wake up, is that useful? If you're writing a historical novel, that's incredibly useful. If you're trying to navigate around town using a 300-year-old map of streets, it's not only not useful, it's probably downright negative, because most of the streets, if not all of them, are different. So it's not a very useful map of reality. There's also, so there's relevance, there's focus. There's also distortion. And there's also emphasis, because there is enough sound out there. If you think of what a rapper or a sampler does, they'll catch a bit of this beat and a little bit of that sound, and they'll repeat this one and do this. And you can create, if you listen to a single song and then sample it, and then slow one bit down, speed another part up, repeat this bit, emphasize this bit, delete this bit, you can turn a sampling of sounds, a single song, into just about anything you want. And then you can add additional things over it. And in doing so, you create your own version of this, of reality, your own version of the song. And that is all about emphasis, is all about what you focus on and why you focus on it, and for what things. So you've got the level of distortion, you've got the level of focus, you've got the level of intention, and then you have things like, let's take hostility. Hostility is anger and hurt that wants to hurt someone else or oneself, or hostile. One could say, is that true? And there's different gradients of truth, because on the one hand you could be in denial and you could say that person is looking at me like this, but they're really happy to see me. That's not a very useful map of reality. It's a more useful map of reality to translate this face, particularly with a tone and with some punching movements or whatever, to say that's a hostile presence. And is that true? Then you have these things like lower and higher truths. So for someone to say that's a friendly person who you should go and smile at, that's not a very good version of reality. You're likely to get punched in the face, which means it's not useful information for well-being. If you've interpreted that as friendly, you've now created more pain and suffering for yourself, and for sure. And is it a map of reality that works? No. If you think hostility is friendly, and you think friendly is being hostile, it doesn't work. Because if someone says, let's be friends, and you punch them in the nose, then they say, okay, let's not be friends, because that's not what I had in mind. It doesn't work to have that cross meaning. But then you look at things like deeper truths, and you say, is hostility the deepest truth? And then you say, okay, well, what is hostility and how does it get created? And where are we evolving as a species and as individuals over time? And in that context, hostility is not the deepest truth. Because the deepest truth is that, every human being over time is learning how to create more and more well-being. Because, and you can see this by the fact that anytime someone has the choice, you give someone the choice to eat a delicious pizza and salad, or to eat raw sewage. They'll smell it, they'll maybe taste it if they haven't tried one, and then they're going to eat the pizza and salad, because there's more well-being that way. Anytime someone can make a choice with certainty, that sustainably increases their well-being over not doing that. We gradually see in evolution a direction of well-being, because people want to have fun, they want to be successful, they want to feel good and not feel bad. Now, beliefs can distort that in the short term. For example, if you have a belief, no pain, no gain, and let's say you're in a burning house, and there's a firewall you have to run through to get out of the burning house. Well, then it's a useful belief, because you've got no pain, no gain. I'm going to get singed, but I'm going to get out of the house and stay alive. I'm not going to burn. So I'm going to increase my pain very shortly to get out. And so you have those types of situations. But if someone could just walk out the back door without being burned at all and get out, they would do that, before they would run through a firewall. So you have, maps of realities that work. And then you can say, well, is being hostile fun? Is it successful? Well, you could say it's more successful than being helpless. For example, if you're just laying and being robbed and being beaten and bullied and stuff, going from helplessness to hostility could be a direction of success. To cause enough pain for the bully that they'll go bully someone else. Oh, thank goodness, I've succeeded. I've used hostility to alleviate some of my suffering. But an intelligent and free individual, by free I mean they can adjust their image, they can adjust their identity, they can adjust their thoughts, their beliefs. They're really free, and they can choose who they want to be. When they try on the face of a warm, successful, happy, generous person, as opposed to a miserable, lonely, blah, blah, blah person, they are going to choose to be happy because it's more fun, because it's more successful. And so then, in the sense, the highest truth is where people are moving towards. Useful information for well-being, a map of reality that works. We move closer and closer to partnership, closer and closer to excellence, closer and closer to synergy, closer and closer to beauty, truth, and goodness, to the divine. And that becomes the deepest truth because it's what everyone's groping towards, moving towards, avoiding so that they don't fuck it up, so that they can succeed when they do connect with it, all of that. And so in our own way, we're all moving towards beauty, truth, and goodness as the highest truth. But on the way there, you've got to keep the body alive. You've got to be able to not get in jail and stuff. And so there may be violations of this beauty, truth, and goodness in this kind of figuring out stage. But ultimately, you learn from your mistakes and you learn from your successes how to succeed with more and more grace. You learn from your mistakes, you learn from your successes how to create more and more well-being, how to be more and more intelligent, as in the efficiency of transforming energy into human well-being. And ultimately, the end-up place is the same. The end-up place is incredibly beautiful, incredibly useful, incredibly true, sustainable, magnificent, a version of reality and a version of being that awakens you, that's a joy to see, like, wow, how did they do that? That's so beautiful. I love that. That's wonderful. I feel happy here. Because when you're in that state, you don't generally, if you have certainty about your ability to sustain the state, you don't generally say, well, I'd rather be bored. I'd rather be lonely, miserable, depressed, suicidal, blah, 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 blah. And so we're on a path in that direction. And truth is on a continuum. And the truths that take us towards that ultimate reality are the most true. And the truths that take us a little bit of a step of the way there are useful truths. But if you understand that truth is a pattern of information that leads the small circle towards the big circle, that leads the small self towards the larger transcendent ecological framework of which it is a part. Then the truth that that is true helps the cell within the body, so to speak, connect with the larger organism in synergy, in partnership. And that depending on the observing and measuring devices of the individual organism, bats don't see, they put out sonar, but they still seek evolution and well-being using that system. And so it doesn't really matter what the observing and measuring device is. Every small self, every small identity reaches out into the larger body of which it is a part, forms a relationship with that larger body through the observing and measuring devices available to it. And out of the observing and measuring devices available to it gets a signal. And that signal may be distorted. It may be out of focus. And it may have it may be incomplete. It may be an incomplete signal. For example, if you believe that joy cannot exist and the signal contains pieces of joy, the belief obscures that part of the signal. So part of the signal doesn't exist for you, but it's being broadcast, but it's not real for you because your belief blocks it. And so you've got, an incomplete signal with a certain amount of distortion, with a certain amount of focus. And then you have, is it useful? If you're driving your car and rather than seeing the road right around you and the cars right around you, you see the road and the cars 30 minutes into the future, and you respond to that, then you're going to crash in the present because you're relating to the wrong time set. And so pain creates attunement, creates awareness. And so it helps us to ground and focus. Fear wakes us up and alerts us to possibilities for pain, etc., and then we can respond. And so as we respond more and more successfully, we start using useful information for well-being to create a map of reality that works. As we develop more skill in that domain, we get better and better at it. And we end up forming a more successful partnership with the larger ecology of which we're a part. I want to close this segment by exploring the creativity of truth. All that is exists. All that is broadcasts in what might be in an analogy put forth as full spectrum light. It's like the white of a television screen with nothing on it. And the individual identity, the ego, can receive full spectrum light up to the point that it can let in. If, of course, the full spectrum light is too intense, then there is a dissolution. There is a dissolving of boundaries, and the individual self ceases to exist. The partition of a separate identity between all that is and the individual self, in that sense, is primarily a negative experience. By negative, what I mean is you take that full spectrum white and you start deleting energy to certain pixels, and they get darker. You delete all energy to certain pictures and they go black. You lower the intensity of certain pixels and they form images. And it is these images, these patterns of energy, that we relate to as true, meaning they're true for us in our experience. So all that is relates to all that is in this full spectrum way. And there is a filter between all that is and this part of all that is. And the filter is determined, for example, by belief. For example, if you're looking at this image and you want to believe that eyes don't exist, you just hold up a line here called a belief, and suddenly you see the rest of the image, but you don't see the eyes. And if you want to say that the nose doesn't exist, well, you just block out the nose, and that doesn't exist either. And now you have a different concept of the whole. You have a partial image. And then you can fill in projections and things and reallocate energy to write over and Photoshop in consciousness what we replace in that void. So that doesn't exist, so that becomes something else. So we have belief. We also can filter and modulate, because we can filter and modulate this full spectrum energy with intention. For example, if I want to look at the dark side of the color spectrum, I can use the narrow beam focus of the conscious mind, which is a zoom-in lens. And I can, for example, in this image, I can turn away from all this stuff over here, and I can just focus right on the blackboard. Now, suddenly, if I focus all of my attention on this one little part, then all of reality is black, supporting the belief that reality is black. If instead I want to focus on all reality is white, I just zoom in on one of these white lines, and suddenly all reality is white. If I want to believe that all that is all that is, then I don't filter so much and just let it be. So there's belief, there's intention. There's also paradigm. Paradigm is the unconscious frame through which we look. And so in that classic example, if all you recognize of yourself is a hammer, then one looks at reality in the context of things to hit with a hammer. Everything becomes a nail, either a nail or a not nail, and that's the paradigm of a hammer. If you have the paradigm of an artist, then everything exists to be sculpted. If you have the paradigm of a teacher, then everything exists to be taught. But a paradigm, a frame of reference, becomes a filter of exclusion. Because if one's primary frame of reference is of that of a teacher, then all of the possibilities for all the other experiences are muted, and things present themselves in the light of teaching opportunities. Well, that's an opportunity to teach this. That's an opportunity to teach this. That's an opportunity to teach this. And so this full spectrum light gets reframed into teaching opportunities. So there's intention, and with intention, for example, if my intention is to create a triangle, well, how do I do it with this full spectrum data? Well, I say, well, there's a dot here, there's a dot here, and there's a dot here. And then there's a dot here, there's a dot here, and there's a dot here. Oh my goodness, there's all these triangles. So there's an intention of finding triangles, and so there they all are. Created, all over the place. Suddenly, there's triangles everywhere. If one's intention is to find evidence of non-physical reality, well, there's this, and there's this, and there's this. If there's an intention of finding evidence that everything is material and physical, etc., well, just look through the physical eyes and don't look through one's spirit eyes. Don't just tune that out and look here. That's an object, that's an object, that's an object, etc. And so there's belief, there's intention, there's emphasis. If there's an agenda to say that this is wrong or this is right, one's emphasis. One can say, well, wrong is pain, and there's a possibility of pain here or an experience of pain here, and so let's emphasize that. And then, there's happiness in between the painful moments, but the real thing is these moments of pains. So between the individual self, what the ego is in many ways is a filter between the consciousness that is contained within the human framework of ego and the consciousness that is everything but the ego, the whole and the part. Now, looked at in the paradigm of an organism, the most important thing for an individual cell in the body, the most important thing for an animal on the planet, the most important thing for you and I is to have an active relationship, a flow of energy between the part and the whole. Now, of course, we have created culturally a number of versions of reality that delete the emphasis on interconnectedness. And so we say, well, I'm me, I'm my own person. Well, how do you come up with that? Well, look at me, I'm separate, no one tells me what to do, and so you emphasize these things. But then you say, well, are you your own person if you stop breathing? Could you do that for the next 24 hours and just show how independent you are? And it's like in 5 minutes you're dead. And could you be your own person and stop drinking? See, these are energy flows. This is a flow of energy. The breath is a flow of energy. Liquids, they come in, they go out. That's a flow of energy. Food, it comes in, it goes out. That's a flow of energy. Motion comes in and comes out. That's a flow of energy. Temperature, heat comes out and it comes in. That's a flow of energy. If this planet was 40 degrees below zero as an entire planet, I'm dead, because this structure allows too much heat to go out and too much cold to come in, and suddenly I don't exist. And so this illusion of independence just completely collapses in a matter of minutes. You cannot even separate the breath from the breath of the larger ecology. You cannot separate the human body from the breath of all the plants that create oxygen. And you cannot separate the plants from the sun, which creates photosynthesis. And so this illusion of separation is just that. It is a complete and utter illusion framed by paradigm and cult thinking. But we can hold that illusion. We can pretend we are independent, even as we cut down trees, etc., up to a point, up until the point where we're dying because there's not enough trees and stuff, and then we have to understand that's not a very valid or useful map of reality. And so if this pattern, because I can reduce all of this energy by, let's say, 90%, just so that I'm not dissolved into the totality of all that is and have some sense of an independent, separate part. So let's say I, universally reduce all energy by 95%, just so that I can maintain some sense of not being obliterated in the light. Then, let's say I let in a little bit of stuff here, and then a little bit of stuff here, and then a little bit of stuff here, and what I'm letting in is in this paradigm of life is suffering. And so I let in a little gap where suffering can get in here, and suffering can get in here, and now my entire world is suffering, because that's what I'm letting in. We take this totality of the whole, and we, what we regulate is, first of all, how balanced this full spectrum energy enters the psyche, enters the consciousness. We also regulate the intensity. And so, we can, you can take the Mona Lisa and you can zoom in using the ego zoom in lens and just focus on the darkness near the Mona Lisa's face and eyes. And there are dark patches in there. And we can say this is a dark image. And we can move our eyes over to the white of the eyes, and this is a luminous image. And so within any context, we are capable of doing this. And this is just a tiny, tiny speck of reality. The truth is that, all that is incredibly majestic. And so with belief, intention, paradigm, emphasis, the thoughts and feelings that flow out of that. Because obviously if your paradigm is the world is one of suffering, and you believe you will suffer, and so you cut a few little slits into consciousness and let these 3 little points of suffering in, and you block everything else out. That's not real, or that'll end soon. That's just an illusion. And so all that comes in is this message that this is painful and this is suffering. And of course, that's also a belief. You can take someone dying, for example, and you could say, this is magnificent. That body rested in the ground is going to fertilize soil. It's going to provide food for worms, etc. But no. That's not what I want to focus. This is a dead person. Everything dies. And so the fact that new life is springing out of that all the time, the fact that within all change there is life and death simultaneously. You cannot have a change without something dissolving and another thing emerging. No energy is created or destroyed. It just changes shape. Well, when it changes shape, it has this dualistic facet because we're looking through a dualistic lens, a lens designed to bring distinction and consciousness through distinction. This is black, this is white. That's why this is different and this is different, and that's how we create. So in this sense, all that is. It's broadcasting. And the question is, within our endless innate creativity, we create a personal rendition of our version of all that is within the nest of all that is, determined by these various filters. And that is our reality. And we can share that with other people. We can have millions of people all set the dials to the same point, and then we can say, this is not our reality, this is the reality. Everyone agrees with me. Because we're all agreeing. That's what cults do. We all agree that we'll set this dial here and we'll set this dial here, and there's two certainties in life, death and taxes, and whatever. It's like, yeah, that's right. Isn't that profound? And so we'll all, hundreds of millions of people will all say that's the certainties in life. But you could also say that there's a million certainties of life, starting with the fact that all things are going to change. Starting with the fact that within every positive there's, I don't want to look at reality that way. I want to look at it, there's two certainties, life or death and taxes. Now we could say then there are also two comparative certainties. There's birth, the certainty of birth, and the certainty of government spending with those taxes, because the one implies the other. But that's a positive spin, and we believe that being negative is more real and more sophisticated. So I'm not going to look wise in a cult that believes that if I say there's two certainties, birth and government spending. It doesn't sound very sophisticated within the lens of beliefs and stuff that says that negativity is shrewd and wise. And so there you have, this fascination and fixation with, a truism, a meme that just spreads out because it fits nicely into the paradigms, beliefs, and preconceptions of the cult around it.